Everyone, welcome to svhouse.tv. My name is Martin, and let me welcome our guest today, Andrej Kiska
Thank you.
from Credo Ventures.
Thank you for the invitation.
Welcome here. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
And right from the start, let's start with the success story that you're involved in. Quite recently, news about Andrej Pančík and his great success was recognized around the Czech Republic and Slovakia startup ecosystem. His company was sold for $100 million, and you were involved in the initial investment. How did it happen that you did catch such a great fish?
As most of these things happen through fairly long relationships and random coincidences. So I first saw Andrej at Startup Awards back in I think 2012, where he was pitching Prizo, which is actually where Represent came from. And we were not involved with Prizo. They raised money predominantly from a series of angels and battery ventures based in the States. So it's also important to note that the Prizo guys or the Represent guys are three co-founders who met at Cambridge. One of them is Slovak, but two of them are American. And so the team is split approximately 50-50 between a Los Angeles office and a Prague office. And when they were first opening up the Prague office, they moved to Tech Square, which is the co-working space where we were sitting at that time, which we helped to fund back in 2010. And so they had an office opposite right of us. So that was very nice. And it was Andrej and a couple of guys at the beginning, and later on they moved out to their own premises. But that's where we got to know each other, and we went to lunch a few times and kept on seeing each other at events. And eventually, when the time came when the guys were considering a larger fundraising round, we started talking again, and that's when the offer from Custom Inc. came as well.
I see. It's all about networks and connections.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And could you name several more success stories, successful exits, investments that you made recent time?
Sure. So, well, it's hard to say several. So we had, in general, 5 exits. 2 of them we consider very big success stories. So one of them is Represent Second Launch Cognitive Security that we sold to Cisco. Then a couple of them are okay, where we sort of got our money back, and a couple of them we just lost all of our money, which is sort of how we typically look at what the performance of the fund should be like. So you have a third of the fund that is doing really well and is returning your entire fund, then a third which is doing okay, so you're basically getting your money back, maybe 2 to 3 times return on investment, and then one third where you basically lose your investment. And that's how our first fund is tracking right now as well.
We speak about success and sometimes failing. What do you think are the biggest strengths, but also weaknesses of entrepreneurs and startups here in CEE, since your Credo Fund Ventures is mainly focusing on startups right here?
Yeah. So there are a lot of specifics. The first one being that our ecosystem is very young and immature, which has a lot of implications for sort of how startups and venture investors look at the landscape here. So we started in 2010 with Credo Ventures, 2011. There was no accelerator here, basically no co-working space, nobody knew what the word startup is. So those are sort of the early days when we try to help to build the basic infrastructure, of which currently now it's plenty of. So you see the co-working spaces, you see the accelerators. So slowly the recognition of what a startup is getting sort of more public attention. But at the same time, what has not changed over the past 5 years is that a lot of our companies are started by first-time founders who have not necessarily had any exposure to a global startup, which brings a lot of specifics to how the startup is built. So the CEOs and the founding team needs a lot more coaching and needs longer time to find the product market fit and fine-tune the product. And at the same time, there is a lot less liquidity on the side of when things are not going very well. So in the States, it's very typical that if a team is of high quality, even if their idea doesn't work, via so-called acqui-hire, they can join another startup or another big corporation, work on something else, and that doesn't happen here very often. And this is what I think gets underestimated, and one of the reasons why failure is looked at a little bit differently here in Central Europe than it is in the States. It's a cultural thing. So, Americans or the Anglo-Saxon culture teaches you that from every failure you come out stronger and you learn something new. Here, failure is a lot more stigmatized. So, oh, this is a guy who already failed, I don't want to touch him. And second, if you fail, that fail tends to be a little bit more spectacular in two ways. One, Anglo-Saxon culture is very good in sort of selling the lessons learned of the failure as opposed to the process of failing itself. And second is the fact that here, if your idea doesn't work, you typically run out of cash and you have to shut down the lights of the company. In the States, it's more rare to see sort of such a rapid development if a company receives, for example, seed or Series A funding, and you see a lot more of the acqui-hires happening or additional bridges of the seed and angel rounds coming in. So the environment is a lot more forgiving there than it is here towards companies that do not find its product market fit as quickly as they planned, which is the vast majority of companies, of course.
I see. That's something that we hear a lot here in interviews in svhouse.tv, culture of failure and lessons learned. And since we're trying now compare these different ecosystems, and as many young entrepreneurs and startups are actually striving to get, let's say, to Silicon Valley, what do you think should be, are the right, proper reasons why really try to get there? And when do you think it's more legitimate whether to decide to stay here and just use anything that is here?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, and it really depends on what kind of business specifically you are building. And what do I mean by that are basically two things. One is, where are your customers? Because at the beginning you need to be as close to your customers as possible. And second, where is the talent that you need in order to build that company? And so typically why companies choose to go to Silicon Valley is for two reasons. The customers are closer there, so especially if you are selling to an enterprise, or even in some cases to end consumers, it's easier to start in Silicon Valley, where, for example, the enterprises are a little bit more open to innovation than they are here. So Roman Stanek, I think, famously said that it's easier to meet with CTO of Morgan Stanley than Komerční banka or something along those lines, right? So, and I think that's very much true, and we see that in our companies as well, where guys from the big corporations would not write back to emails, but if the CEO writes an email, hey, I will be in Bali for a week, do you want to meet up? They write back immediately and say, yeah, coming for a coffee and let's chat. So a lot more things get done if you get to talk to the customers in person. Now, with that being said, the environment is pretty hostile towards someone who does not have a regular exposure to it in two ways. One, there is sort of a lot of buzz, a lot of competition, a lot of motion going on, and second, it's just very expensive. So A, it's more difficult to make yourself being noticed in Silicon Valley. And B, you need to have a lot of cash to spend a significant amount of time and hire people there. Which brings me back to sort of your question of timing. When is a good time to go? Well, if you have a lot of funding and you feel like your first customers are there, yeah, go ahead and make that leap. And if you can secure those first customers, there's a higher chance you'll be able to fundraise in the future in the Valley as well. What we tend to advise to our startups is first build some traction, get some customers either somewhere in Europe, or you as a CEO spend some time there but don't necessarily move the team, and you will be a lot more heard and visible with the traction than if you are pre-traction. At the same time, if you received funding from US VCs, which is extremely difficult, and I think basically all our startups underestimate the lengthiness and the complications of the process. So typically, the vision I hear is, well, we are going to move to the States for 3 months, we are going to fundraise some money, we are going to get our investor, and then, we'll be fine. And nothing gets done in 3 months in the States. That time flies by very quickly, and everybody will tell you, yeah, we are excited, this looks good, just get a little bit more traction, or we'll just need to get some additional information, and they keep on delaying it, at the same time not sort of losing you the enthusiasm in you, which is not a great aspect of the Anglo-Saxon culture, that they can say no in a way that it doesn't seem like it's a no. So you are always on your toes and saying, next week I'm finally going to fundraise, next week I'm going to get that cash, and all of a sudden from the next week it's an additional 12 weeks and you still don't have that cash. So in many ways it's easier to start here because there's a very strong investor ecosystem by now. So there are a lot of startups, a lot of investors, and there's a lot of talent. Compared to the United States, it's much easier to get, especially on the technical side, the right employees to help you build that product. And this is what's really important in those beginning, the seed stages and sort of pre-Series A, to have a product that's ready for those customers. And once you secure the first customers, once you have that revenue, it's much easier to go and fundraise in the States. Because if it takes that long time, you can always rely on your investors back here that they can back you.
I see.
So I think that's a sort of more comfortable way to try to penetrate Silicon Valley.
You already gave us some advices, about fundraising, but is there anything else that you would highlight to, early stage startups to get fundraising, whether here or there in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so I think we talked a little bit about how complicated it is in the States. And I think what people underestimate is, if you want to fundraise anywhere else from Central Europe, you have to realize that the venture capitalist likes to have you close, likes to work with you in some way, and that proximity is very important because taking a flight already is a hassle, and if that flight is spanning across multiple time zones, that hassle becomes exponentially higher. That's why even if you are trying to fundraise in London, the London investors are going to look at you differently if you have a team there than if you just come there from the fundraising. And the same thing is for Silicon Valley. So that presence in terms of the team and ideally the customer base is super important for you to be successful. Because the investors rarely want to invest in a company that's not based there unless you are doing superbly well. So from this perspective, unless you have a long-term commitment to staying in that location, I would discourage you from having fundraising in either London or in the States because it's going to be very difficult. And it's easier at the beginning to work with Central European investors. And my advice when you talk to Central European investors is to speak to many of them. Don't pick just one or two. It does great things to your terms, and at the same time you get to know who is the best in terms of who fits your personality. Because I think the biggest problem in Central Europe is that our local investors are not used to working with startups. So there are a lot of investors here who still think that if they invest, they basically get to say how the business is done. And that's not how startup investing should work. So the investor should be there as a backup for when a startup is solving some problems and to help with those problems, but not to make decisions on behalf of that company. And a lot of local investors still don't understand that. So it's very important to speak to as many people as possible to find that right chemistry with the person that really you feel like you can work with.
Once you approach the right investors, like what would your suggestions, how to build a powerful pitch? What would you highlight?
So I have like an hour-long presentation on how to pitch to investors. So it's a long list. But I think so. For us, what's really important and what typically a lot of entrepreneurs don't do a very good job presenting is how is your product really 10 times better than the competition, and how does it fit into where the market is going? Sort of skating to where the puck is going to be. We have a lot of guys coming in saying we are solving our own problem, which we experience somewhere, but don't necessarily see the bigger picture, the context in which that startup is operating. And that for us is very important because your product has to fit into that context fairly well in the long run. And just because you solve your problem doesn't mean that's the most efficient way to solve that problem for another 10,000 customers out there. So that market exposure, especially in different markets, is very important.
What are usually the main KPIs focus on?
So this really depends on the stage. If you are coming in, so a lot of our investments happen at the seed stage. So roughly, I think for Credo at least, roughly 50% of our investments, the first investments into the company will come at the seed stage. So it's at a stage where you have first versions of the product ideally used by some early adopters, and you are trying to build some new version of the product that's sort of more final, based on which you can sort of scale it to a higher number of customers. So what's really important there is the product capability, that you really have a team, an internal team. This is another thing. We see a lot of companies trying to outsource part of the entire development, and we are quite strongly against that, and it's a longer discussion why. But having that internal team and that capability to really deliver is super crucial. And what we also look for is then, if the team is strong on the technical side, then typically what's missing is that hustler or that first business person who is able to validate that product with a lot of customers, which is super important. So a lot of our startups still develop the product in isolation, especially if it's a technical founder DNA. They sort of lock themselves in the office, code something, and just wait for the product to be super polished before coming out, and underestimate sort of that you need that engagement with the product to really fine-tune it. So the second thing we look at aside from the product is that right composition of the team. So they are strong on the product, but at the same time have somebody there who understands the customer, thinks like the customer, and can introduce them to those first customers and adopters.
I see, and you compared, or you said you're discouraging startups or entrepreneurs from outsourcing. Do you find a team or company culture important in the whole process?
Yeah, totally. So there are two reasons why that outsourcing gets very difficult. One is what you said; it's the culture, and what we mean specifically by culture. So Ben Horowitz actually has a great talk with Dick Costolo that he did recently, and what those guys said is what they look for in culture. So people join startups for a variety of reasons: cash, growing talent, or satisfying your own ambition, learning something new. But the strongest motivation is if you are there and doing things for the other guys. So that's the notion that we are sitting there together and we are pulling through even tough times because we are friends and we are kind of doing it for each other as a sort of band of brothers. Right? So there's the kind of culture when things are going bad, and in a startup things always get bad. They tend to stick together. There is not much churn, and they are able to pull through even if the cash is low or whatever problems they are facing. And this is very hard to do with an external team because you don't build the same relationship. You don't have a very consistent culture like that. And at the same time, that product in some way has to be super unique, right? And there's a very good chance that whatever you're doing, you have competition that is trying to do something similar. And in order to advance that product and be really on top of that innovation curve, you need to think about that product 24/7, right? Like you need to go to bed thinking about how to make that product better. Your brain is going to implicitly process it or unconsciously process it at night. And in the morning, in the shower, you are going to realize some new ideas. You don't even know where they came from. And if you don't have that, like if you're doing it externally as a 9-to-5 development, you are never going to get into that mindset. And your product is not going to be even close to the potential it can achieve.
Right.
And that's super important.
And so once the deal is closed, like what does the relationship that the founder and investor should have, and what are the next steps after the deal is closed?
So maybe I will actually start with before the deal is closed, if I may. And there's just one thing which is important, which Central European startups underestimate, and that's the length of time it takes to complete a transaction. So don't come to an investor saying, you need to decide next week whether you are going to invest, and in 2 weeks I need to have that cash. That's just poor planning. Like, it's going to take 2 to 3 months, and if that investor doesn't take the time to get to know the people and you don't feel the chemistry, you as an entrepreneur should not go into the transaction either, because you don't know who you are really letting into that company. And building that relationship takes some time. So if you are coming to the investor for the first time and saying, I need that cash as soon as possible, like yesterday was late, that shows sort of an immaturity in the founder and his inability to understand how the investment process works. So before sort of you try to fundraise and estimate how long it's going to take, plan for 2 to 3 months and come to the investor ideally 4 months in advance. And then things are going to go smoothly. And then once you sign the transaction documentation, the relationship is not damaged, because sometimes what happens is the transaction gets so rushed because the company needs the money immediately that it hurts the relationship. Like, everybody is nervous, mistakes get made, everybody blames somebody else for the delays and so on. And that's a very bad way to start a relationship. And once you have the relationship, the proper way to set it up, so we tend to work in a board of directors. So what that means is, when we invest, we typically invest in a company which has a new, not necessarily statutory body, but a body that is based on a gentleman's agreement backed up by a contract that says we are going to meet once per month, and we are going to discuss the most important things that are facing the company and try to figure out how to help solve those problems. And it's very important early on to establish those regular meetings, and at the same time sort of natural communication with the investor, because if you don't have, once a week a call or once per 2 weeks a call, if you don't spend your time preparing for the board meeting at the beginning, that's when you set the culture for how those meetings are going to look for the next year or two. And it's very hard to change that culture once you sort of get underway and have a certain pattern that you tend to repeat. That's why it's very important at the beginning to say, look guys, we're going to meet once a month, it's going to be for 2 to 3 hours, and we always have sort of, or I send my founder some package or a sample size of what the agenda should look like, what are the kind of problems we should address. And it's very important to structure that board of directors efficiently, because a lot of startups either spend too much time reporting and not enough time problem solving, meaning they're going to say, we spoke to this customer and he said this customer. Well, I don't really care what every customer said, right? Like, you have an internal team for that. And it should be much more of a problem solving session. Or on the other hand, you feel threatened by the board and don't want to put up or show that you have problems because you feel like you need to report only the good news to the board. So it's very important to understand that the investor there is for you to help solve those problems. And if you are not being honest with him, or you are not digging into those issues that really, really bother you, then you are not using your board very efficiently, and that's a big loss.
I see. And we've covered many things, and we're slightly going to the end. So what would be kind of last suggestions, recommendation that you would give to startups, whether here in Central European region or anywhere else?
So a lot of Central European founders have the king mentality. So there is this school of thought that says that there are two kinds of people. One that is maximizing wealth of the company, and one that is maximizing control of the company. So let's call him the king guy and sort of the rich guy. And I think it's a cultural thing, and I think it's also because of sort of collective ownership culture that we had here for about 50 years. But our founders have a very hard time parting with control and of equity in their company, which at the end of the day means they are not going to be able to attract the best talent because they want some equity. And at the same time, if you are not willing to give them, the key employees, the autonomy to make the decisions on their behalf, on their own, you are micromanaging the company, and you as a CEO, at some point if the company is growing, are actually becoming the biggest bottleneck of the company, because you are not willing to give up control in certain processes or in certain functions. So, and this is a pattern across basically all our companies we see. They do not give up enough control to key employees and enough equity to attract the top talent. So I would encourage the founders to be generous with both of those, because it's in their long-term benefit.
Perfect. We here in svhouse TV are big lifelong learners. So before we finish, is there any recent learning that you got and that you'd like to share?
Any recent learning? I guess the biggest lesson for me recently, also watching my dad over the past couple of years, is that don't start a startup unless you really believe in the mission of what you're solving. So a lot of founders start the company for the wrong reasons. And I see this playing out now in some of those companies where things are going tough, that they do not enjoy the process of the startup. They would like to enjoy the result of it, which being, very popular, famous, rich, what have you, but not necessarily the grind that is required when the things get tough, and to really sit there and take tough decisions. So I would say, if you do not enjoy, and I was asked this question yesterday, like, it bothers me to start a startup because I am afraid that I'm going to give up the rest of my life. So that learning for me is, there's a quote that says, if you find the job that you love, you will never have to work ever again, right? Because it's pleasure for you. So if you do not derive pleasure from being a CEO of a startup, then don't do it, because you're not going to like it.
That was really powerful. Thanks a lot, Andrej. Thanks for having you here.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.